The summer of 1940 began with the sound of engines. Over the green fields of England, the skies trembled with war. The world called it the Battle of Britain, but for the young men of the Royal Air Force, it was something far more personal. They called it simply, the battle for home. Every dawn, hundreds of pilots, most barely out of their teens, scrambled from small airfields across southern England. They climbed into their Hurricanes and Spitfires, eyes fixed on the rising sun, hearts pounding beneath their leather jackets. Above them, the enemy was already coming. The Luftwaffe had begun its relentless assault on Britain. Wave after wave of German bombers crossed the Channel, Heinkels, Dorniers, Junkers, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109s that gleamed like knives in the morning light. Their target was simple: London, to break the heart of a nation that refused to surrender. Among those who rose to meet them was a 29-year-old pilot from Liverpool, Flight Sergeant Raymond Towers Holmes, of No. 504 Squadron, RAF. He wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the most decorated. But that September morning, he would do something no one else had done. Something that would echo through history. Holmes had joined the RAF years earlier, driven by quiet duty more than glory. He'd spent nights writing letters home, telling his mother not to worry, joking about the noise upstairs that never seemed to stop. His Hurricane, serial number P2725, had become almost part of him. He'd named it Polly, after the family's parrot that never stopped talking. He used to say, "If Polly can outlast me, she's earned her stripes." On September 15, 1940, Holmes was stationed at RAF Northolt, one of the key fighter bases defending London. The morning began quietly, with mist hanging over the tarmac, but by 11 a.m., reports flooded in. German bombers approaching the capital in formation. Sirens wailed across the city. People dove into shelters. Church bells stopped ringing. In the control room, the radio crackled. "Angels 20, bandits inbound, scramble." Holmes dropped his tea, grabbed his helmet, and ran. The ground crew waved as he climbed into his Hurricane. The Merlin engine roared to life, a sound that seemed to shake the earth itself. As he lifted off, the world below shrank into a patchwork of fields, smoke, and sunlight. Ahead he could already see them. Hundreds of black dots moving like locusts across the sky. The radio was chaos. Pilots shouting bearings, code words, fragments of prayer. Holmes steadied his voice. "Blue 2 airborne, climbing to 20,000. The wind tore past his canopy. His heart hammered. The sky above London was alive with gunfire. Tracer rounds arcing through clouds. Engines screaming. The thunder of bombs in the distance. By noon, the air battle was chaos. Spitfires and Hurricanes twisted in every direction, diving through smoke and sunlight. Explosions bloomed like fireflowers against the clouds. Holmes spotted a Heinkel He-111 bomber breaking formation. Its engines were sputtering, but it was heading straight for central London. He radioed his squadron leader. "One Heinkel heading for the city. I'm going after him." He dove, throttle open, his Hurricane vibrating with strain. The Heinkel grew larger, its black cross visible on the fuselage, its gunner already firing. Bullets ripped past Holmes's canopy, shattering the glass. He ducked instinctively, closing one eye against the splinters. He pressed the trigger. Nothing. His guns had jammed. For a moment, everything went silent. The roar of engines faded. The world seemed to hold its breath. Below him, the Heinkel was less than a mile from London. Its target, Buckingham Palace. If it dropped its bombs, hundreds would die. Holmes glanced at his controls. Empty ammo, no chance of landing. He had one option left. He gritted his teeth and whispered to himself, "Right, Polly. One last dance." He pushed the throttle to full and aimed his Hurricane directly at the bomber's tail. The impact came like thunder. Metal tore, wings shattered. The Heinkel split apart, its fuselage breaking mid-air. Holmes's own plane was ripped open, oil and flame pouring over the cockpit. For a second, he couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Then, silence again. He pulled the canopy release, unbuckled, and threw himself into the sky. The air tore the breath from his lungs. Below him, London stretched endlessly, rooftops, smoke, and the glint of the Thames. He watched his burning Hurricane spiral downward, disappearing into the city below. He hit the ground hard in a narrow street, near Victoria Station, only a few hundred yards from Buckingham Palace. He was bruised, bleeding, but alive. As he staggered to his feet, a police officer ran toward him, astonished. "Are you all right, sir?" Holmes looked up, dazed, and managed a faint smile. "Yes, I think I just stopped someone from visiting the king." That afternoon, word spread like fire across London. A single RAF pilot had rammed a bomber to save the city. Crowds cheered as he was escorted away, his torn uniform flapping in the wind. He became a symbol, not of destruction, but of selfless courage. The man who chose to crash his plane, rather than let the city burn. The smoke over London that day could be seen for miles. Thick columns rose from the docks, from warehouses, from the heart of the East End, each one a scar on the city's sky. The Germans called it the Blitz. To Londoners it was simply the night that never ended. Every few minutes, the air shook. Bombs fell on schools, hospitals, homes. And still, the people refused to run. In the underground, families huddled together on train platforms, listening to the echo of explosions far above. Children clutched gas masks like toys. Some sang softly, trying to drown the fear. High above, Flight Sergeant Ray Holmes had become part of that sky, one small figure in a war larger than imagination. His unit, number 504 Squadron, flew out of RAF Northolt, protecting the city from the Luftwaffe's daily raids. Every mission was the same: scramble, climb, fight, survive, if possible. The Hurricanes were slower than Spitfires, but sturdier. The workhorses of the Battle of Britain. Holmes often joked, "The Spitfire's a ballerina, the Hurricane's a boxer. Guess which one I am?" But behind his humor was fatigue. Every sortie meant seeing friends vanish into smoke. Every dawn meant counting how many chairs were empty at breakfast. By the second week of September 1940, nearly 500 German aircraft were crossing the Channel daily. The RAF was outnumbered 3-1. Yet somehow, they still rose to meet them. The pilots lived minute to minute, fueled by adrenaline, cigarettes, and tea that never stayed warm. Mechanics slept beside the runways, ready to refuel between sorties. They patched bullet holes with tape and hope. One afternoon, while waiting for the next alarm, Holmes wrote a short note in his logbook. "If today's the day, then let it be quick. Tell Mother I saw the sun from closer than most men ever will." He tucked the note behind his flight badge, a quiet goodbye that no one would read for decades. September 15th dawned clear. The sky looked calm, blue, even beautiful. But radar screens across southern England told a different story. Dots appearing by the hundreds. The biggest raid yet. At 11 o'clock a.m., Churchill himself visited the underground operations room at RAF Fighter Command. He watched the markers moving toward London and whispered to Air Chief Dowding, "There appears to be a great battle developing." Dowding nodded gravely. "Yes, Prime Minister. and it will decide the war. Moments later, orders flashed to every squadron. Scramble! Intercept incoming bombers over the city! Engines roared to life across Britain. At Northolt, Ray Holmes was already running for his Hurricane. His hands were steady, his breath calm. Ready to go, Sergeant? His mechanic shouted. Holmes grinned. Ready as I'll ever be. The canopy closed with a metallic click. Moments later, his plane thundered down the runway and lifted into the morning sky. Cheers. The scene above London was apocalyptic. More than 1,000 aircraft filled the air. Bombers in tight formation, fighters weaving around them. Tracer fire streaked like lightning across the clouds. Holmes joined his formation at 18,000 feet. Over the radio came the voice of his leader. 504 Squadron, engage at will. He dove toward the nearest bomber, firing short bursts. The rattle of machine guns vibrating through his arms. He saw flames erupt from a Heinkel's engine, watched its wing break away and spiral down. But there were too many. Every time one bomber fell, 3 more appeared behind it. London below was a patchwork of explosions. Rail yards, factories, the docks near the Thames. He could see smoke rising from St. Paul's Cathedral, from Whitehall, from the rooftops of homes where families once had breakfast in peace. Radio chatter filled his ears. Voices of comrades. Calm one moment, gone the next. Red 3, he's on your tail. I've lost him. Mayday, mayday. I'm hit, bailing out. Holmes weaved through the chaos, his canopy streaked with oil and smoke. He fired again and again until his ammunition light flickered empty. He looked around. The sky full of falling planes, smoke trails, and parachutes. Below, the city burned. Then he saw it. A lone Heinkel bomber gliding low, engines coughing, heading straight for Buckingham Palace. His heart froze. If that bomber reached the palace, the king and queen, who refused to leave London, could die. The symbol of Britain itself would fall. Holmes pushed his throttle to maximum and dove. The bomber's gunner opened fire, bullets shattering Holmes's canopy. The wind howled through the cockpit. He wiped the blood from his forehead and tried to aim, but his guns were already empty. He could have turned back. No one would have blamed him. But that wasn't in him. He steadied his grip, muttering under his breath, "You're not getting through, not today." He lined up the enemy plane's tail in his sights. The Heinkel filled his view, its black crosses, its gunners still firing wildly. Holmes pushed forward. The impact came like an explosion, the Hurricane's propeller slicing into the bomber's tail. Metal screamed. The Heinkel broke apart in the air. Flames burst from both planes. For a heartbeat, everything vanished in white light. Then, silence. Holmes's Hurricane was shredded, oil pouring over the windshield. He pulled the canopy lever, unstrapped, and threw himself into the void. The rush of wind stole his breath. Below, London spread out like a painting in smoke and fire. He saw the bomber crash harmlessly into a railway yard, its bombs detonating away from civilians. He'd done it. As his parachute opened, he whispered a single word into the wind. Home. He drifted down through the haze, landing in a quiet street near Victoria Station, only a few hundred yards from where the king himself was standing that morning. London was saved. When Flight Sergeant Ray Holmes opened his eyes, everything was silent. The air smelled of smoke and burning fuel. For a moment, he didn't know if he was alive or dead. He lay in the middle of Chelsea, just streets away from Victoria Station, a part of London that had been burning all morning. Shards of glass glittered on the pavement. A bicycle lay twisted nearby. His parachute had snagged on a lamppost, fluttering gently in the wind. He could still hear the faint echo of sirens and distant anti-aircraft fire. He moved his hand. Pain shot through his side, but it meant he was still breathing. His RAF uniform was torn, the flight badge smeared with soot. He rolled over, coughing, and tried to stand. A young woman's voice cried out from across the street. "He's one of ours! He's British!" Within seconds, people began to appear. From doorways, from shelters, from behind broken cars. Men, women, children, all running toward the man who had fallen from the sky. A constable reached him first. He looked Holmes up and down, disbelief on his face. "Good God, man, what happened?" Holmes tried to smile, but his lips were cracked. "I ran out of bullets." The officer blinked. "And then?" Holmes pointed toward the smoke in the distance. "So I rammed him." For a few seconds, the officer just stared. Then he laughed in disbelief, shaking his head. Only an RAF man would think of that. Holmes was helped to his feet. His right arm hung limp, but his eyes were steady. Around him, civilians cheered. A small crowd of dust-covered Londoners clapping and shouting his name. To them, he wasn't just a soldier. He was proof that London could fight back. Meanwhile, just a few streets away, the wreckage of both aircraft burned in the gardens behind Buckingham Palace Road. The Heinkel's fuselage had slammed into the pavement, scattering fragments across rooftops and chimneys. Miraculously, no civilians had been killed. Reporters were already arriving, snapping photographs, interviewing witnesses. An elderly man told the press. He came out of nowhere, like a hawk out of the sun, hit the Hun clean out of the sky. Another said, "We saw his plane on fire, thought he'd gone. Then, suddenly, a parachute opened right above us. The whole street cheered." Holmes was taken to a nearby first aid post, a small shop converted into an emergency clinic. A nurse cleaned the cuts on his face, muttering, "You're lucky to be alive." Holmes gave a faint grin. Luck had nothing to do with it. Gravity did most of the work. Word spread quickly through the city. An RAF pilot had rammed a German bomber to save Buckingham Palace. The newspapers printed it within hours. Headlines screamed, "Lone hurricane pilot saves London. RAF hero rams enemy over palace. Lives." By nightfall, his name was known across Britain. But for Holmes, the glory meant little. As he sat on a stretcher drinking a cup of tea, his hand, shook. He could still see the faces of the enemy crew, the Heinkel's gunners firing until the last second. He didn't know if they'd survived. To him, war was not about hatred. It was duty. He'd once written in a letter home, "We don't hate them, really. We just have to stop them before they destroy everything we love." Now, as he looked at the smoldering horizon of London, he whispered quietly, "I did what I had to do." That night, the city was dark but unbroken. Fires still burned across the East End, but the palace stood untouched. The King and Queen had remained in London, visiting bombed areas, speaking to survivors. At 10 Downing Street, Churchill received the report personally. He read it once, then twice, before setting it down and saying softly, "That man embodied the spirit of Britain." In the days that followed, Holmes became a reluctant hero. He was photographed beside his wrecked hurricane, smiling shyly. Newspapers described him as the man who fought with his wings. Children wrote him letters of thanks. One note, from a girl in London, said, "Dear Mr. Pilot, my mummy says you saved us. I will pray for you every night." He kept that letter for the rest of his life. The RAF examined the wreckage of his hurricane and confirmed what few believed possible. He had deliberately rammed the German bomber after running out of ammunition. It was an act of courage, or madness, that defied logic, but defined bravery. Holmes was offered a medical leave, but he refused. When asked why, he said simply, "I'd rather be up there than down here thinking about it." A few days later, he visited the crash site again. The smell of oil still hung in the air. Children climbed on twisted metal, pretending to be pilots. A piece of his plane, the tail fin, had been carried to a nearby shop window. A hand-painted sign read, "The plane that saved the palace." Holmes stood quietly, looking at it for a long time. Then he took off his cap and whispered under his breath, "You did well, Polly. You did well." The morning after his crash, London was still smoldering. The fires had burned through the night, casting a red glow against the clouds. Yet, amid the ash and ruin, something new filled the air: hope. The people spoke of one man, one act that had defied the impossible. The pilot who'd rammed a bomber to save their city. His name was on every radio broadcast, every headline. For a nation exhausted by war, Flight Sergeant Ray Holmes had become a symbol, proof that courage could still rise from chaos. In the hospital ward at RAF Uxbridge, Holmes awoke to the smell of disinfectant and tea. His arm was bandaged, his face bruised, but his spirit was intact. He turned his head and saw a nurse smiling at him. "You're quite famous today," she said gently. He blinked, confused. "Famous? For crashing my plane?" She chuckled. "For saving the king's house." On his bedside table sat a pile of letters, dozens of them. Children, soldiers, even the Queen's household had written. Some were short. "Thank you for saving London." Others were long and filled with emotion. Words of pride, relief, gratitude. Holmes read each one slowly, his lips tightening with every line. He had never thought of himself as a hero. He was just doing his job. A few days later, a message came through from Buckingham Palace. The King and Queen wished to meet him. Holmes, still walking with a limp, was escorted to the palace in full uniform. The same building he had protected now stood quietly in the morning sun, its windows reflecting the sky he had once fought in. When he entered the room, the king extended his hand and said, "Flight Sergeant Holmes, you have done your country a great service." Holmes saluted, humbled. "Just doing my duty, sir." The Queen smiled warmly. "Then it is men like you who remind us why we stand tall." They spoke for several minutes, not as ruler and soldier, but as people who had both looked death in the eye and refused to bow. When he left the palace, reporters gathered outside shouting questions. One of them asked, "Would you do it again, Sergeant?" Holmes paused, then answered softly, "If London needed me, yes," without a second thought. Back at Northolt, his squadron greeted him like a brother returned from the dead. They had thought he was gone for good. Instead, there he was, grinning, still wearing his torn flight jacket, his hands bandaged but steady. His commanding officer clapped him on the shoulder. "You mad fool," he said, laughing. "You realize you took out a Heinkel with your plane?" Holmes smirked. "Couldn't let the chaps have all the fun." But beneath the jokes, he carried the weight of what he'd done. He'd survived, but so many hadn't. Every night, when the base went quiet, he would walk to the edge of the runway and stare into the dark sky. Somewhere up there, his friends still flew, names now carved on wooden boards in the mess hall. He once told a mechanic, "People cheer when you fall from the sky and live. They forget the others who fell and didn't." By October 1940, the Battle of Britain was drawing to a close. The Luftwaffe had failed to break the RAF. Churchill's words echoed across the world. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Holmes was one of those few. But instead of returning home, he volunteered for further service, ferrying aircraft, instructing new pilots, and later joining the RAF Photographic Reconnaissance Division, capturing aerial intelligence over enemy lines. He joked that after crashing into a bomber, the RAF figured he might do better behind a camera than a gun. But in truth, the war had changed him. He had seen the face of destruction and had chosen compassion, even in combat. After the war ended in 1945, Holmes returned to civilian life. He became a journalist, a storyteller instead of a fighter. When asked why, he said, "Because I've seen too much of death. I'd rather spend the rest of my life so, if recording life." He covered political stories, royal events, even the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, the daughter of the monarch he had once saved. Yet he never boasted, never sought recognition. To his colleagues, he was just Ray, the quiet man with the calm voice and faraway eyes. Still, every September, he would take out a small photograph, his old Hurricane Polly, before that final flight. The picture was faded, edges burned, but he kept it pressed between the pages of his journal. On the back, he had written one line: "For London, for everyone who never came home." As the years passed, the story of his ramming faded into history books and documentaries, often told in a few brief sentences. But those who had seen it never forgot. To them, he wasn't just a pilot. He was a guardian, a symbol of sacrifice. When interviewed in the 1980s, Holmes was asked what he remembered most. He smiled faintly and said, "I remember how quiet it was after I hit him. The sky went completely silent. I thought, so this is what peace must sound like." The war had ended, but for Ray Holmes, the skies never really grew quiet. Every time he heard an engine overhead, he looked up, not with fear, but with memory. To him, the sound of flight was the sound of freedom, hard won. He lived a modest life in London after the war, never rich, never seeking fame. When asked about his service, he always said the same thing: "We were just doing our job, nothing more, nothing less." But to those who remembered September 15th, 1940, he was the man who proved that courage had no limit. In 1946, the RAF invited him to speak at a memorial for fallen pilots. The crowd stood silently as Holmes approached the microphone. He looked out at the rows of empty seats, each one representing a life lost. His voice was steady, low, almost gentle. "They say I saved London, but it was they who saved all of us. Every day, every flight, every dawn they never saw. I just happened to be the one who came back." The audience rose in quiet applause. Holmes saluted, then stepped down, tears hidden behind his aviator glasses. In the decades that followed, Britain changed. New buildings rose where bombs had once fallen. Children played in streets that had once been cratered by war. Yet somewhere, beneath the surface of that peace, the story of one pilot lived on, whispered by veterans, remembered by families, honored by historians. Holmes went on to work for BBC television and later became a royal correspondent, the man who once defended Buckingham Palace now reporting from its gates. When colleagues discovered who he was, they often asked, "How did it feel, Sergeant, in that moment before the crash?" He would smile faintly. "It didn't feel like dying. It felt like flying straight into history." As the century turned, the world began to forget. But in September 2004, over 60 years after that fateful flight, history spoke again. Construction crews digging near Victoria Station uncovered twisted metal buried deep beneath the streets. Engine fragments, steel braces, cockpit shards, all blackened and corroded. At first, no one understood what they had found. Then a historian on site recognized the serial number stamped on a piece of aluminum, P2725.T. He remains of Ray Holmes's Hurricane, Polly. The news spread across Britain like wildfire. The plane that had saved the palace had been found, still resting beneath the city it defended. Holmes, then 90 years old, was invited to the site. He stood by the pit, looking down at the wreckage. The same plane he had flown into a bomber 6 decades earlier. Reporters waited for a quote. He looked at them, eyes bright with memory, and said quietly, "She's home at last." That autumn, the RAF honored him with a special ceremony. Veterans, cadets, and schoolchildren lined the airfield. The Battle of Britain Memorial Flight roared overhead, Hurricanes and Spitfires flying in perfect formation. As they passed, Holmes raised his hand in salute. The wind caught his gray hair, and for a moment, he looked every bit the young pilot he had once been. He turned to a nearby officer and said softly, "You know, I can still feel the vibration of that Merlin engine in my bones." The officer smiled. "And we still fly because of men like you, sir." Holmes passed away just a year later, in 2005, at the age of 90. The RAF draped his coffin in the Union Jack and flew a single Hurricane overhead during his funeral. The same type of aircraft he had flown that September morning in 1940. Its shadow crossed the churchyard like a silent salute. Among his few possessions was the small photograph he had kept for decades. His Hurricane sitting on the tarmac, sunlight glinting off the fuselage. On the back were his handwritten words. "For London. For everyone who never came home." Today, at the RAF Museum in London, a section of his plane rests behind glass, bent metal, faded paint, and a simple plaque that reads, "Flight Sergeant Ray Holmes, RAF No. 504 Squadron, rammed an enemy bomber over London, September 15, 1940. To protect his country, he gave up his wings, but never his spirit." Visitors stand quietly before it, some in awe, some in tears. The display is small, but the story it tells is vast. The measure of one man's courage in a moment when the world needed it most. As the music swells softly, the narrator's voice fades over archival footage. Young RAF pilots running to their planes, mechanics saluting, Londoners waving from shelters. The screen slowly turns sepia, like an old film reel rediscovered. They were ordinary men who became extraordinary by choice, not by fate. And among them was one who proved that even when the sky falls, courage can rise higher still. Flight Sergeant Ray Holmes, the pilot who sacrificed himself to save London. The film ends on a grainy still photograph, Holmes standing beside his Hurricane, smiling faintly, the city he saved glimmering behind him. The sound of an engine echoes softly, fading into silence. Fade to black.